we're going to delve deep into the subject of negative space, which too often gets ignored, but we're going to give its due diligence today.
When we're working with negative space, we're working with the container that creates the environment in which our images live. Negative space doesn't mean bad space, it means space outside of images. In this painting by Sorolla, we can see right in here all these areas where the boats live are the positive space. All of these images, and not only the images of the boats, but the image of this little piece of whatever that is right there. The negative space is what's happening in the sky and what's happening in the water. Traditionally, those spaces have been called background and foreground, but I think that's misleading. I think it's clearer when we call those spaces environment, because what we do with those spaces should support the positive spaces, not just be a background or a foreground that we place around them. Let's look at how Sorolla supports the positive shapes with his negative shapes. No matter what those clouds were doing, Sorolla has arranged them. If you'll notice the emphasis of the clouds, he's arranged them in a diagonal movement like this, and then he's given the edge of the clouds a counter diagonal movement like that. That apex of where the diagonals meet is right in here above that center boat, and then that also helps give a more dynamic movement to the entire piece. He's done other things too, but that's what I wanted to point out to you, because that's the major thing he's done with this negative area of the sky. In the water, we often have in the water reflections of the images that will participate. And he's done that here. He's recognized the reflections here. And all that leads in, the reflections themselves lead into the images. These distant images lead into the foreground boats. So that's a brief summary of what Sorolla does here with the negative space. But that's the way master painters manage negative space. They make it a part of the environment, a part of a supportive message for the whole piece. Let's explore that idea further with this figure study by Sorolla. His focus is on studying this figure of this young boy. But notice he's treated the negative area very sensitively, creating the darker and slightly warmer areas in here, and then allowing those areas to get a little cooler in the distant area, and then a little bit darker around the boy's face, and a little lighter as it goes out, honoring the light that's striking the boy, as well as studying the boy himself. Now, let's change that up just a little bit and show you what the effects would be if he had just considered that negative space to be foreground or background. And I'm really going to go to the extreme here. But look at the difference. And now we just have blank space around the boy. It does nothing. It does nothing to contribute to the composition of the boy at all, even though his intention here was to study this as a figure. Let's compare the difference again. You see what a difference being sensitive to that negative area makes? By having the negative area to participate in the total composition, He's given a life to that figure that this sort of placement just doesn't do. Let's go to another extreme. Let's throw the boy in a different kind of environment. Can you see now how the interpretation changes? Of course, I don't have the cast shadows of the boy placed in the environment, but just considering as environment, now we see a different story. Not just a study of a figure, but a figure that is in a particular environment, still feeling supportive, although a totally different interpretation. So I just used two key words there that tell us the role negative space plays in our painting: support and interpretation. The interpretation of the whole painting depends upon what we do within the negative space to support the rest of the images. The way Sorolla supports the figure with his negative area here is by using the same colors and temperature of colors that is used in the figure in these areas within the negative area, so that the eye flows smoothly through that color from the negative into the positive. And then as we go up into the upper area, we can see the colors that he's used here are slightly cooler. And so he's made them a little bit cooler, but continued to use that cool temperature in the negative area to enhance or emphasize the warmth that he's left here within the figure itself. So he's used color here, or the repetition or continuation of color, from positive into negative in order to support the interpretation of a figure within a three-dimensional space. One thing that's sometimes confusing to painters is that there are really two kinds of negative space. Space made of shapes that play a single role in the painting, and shapes that play a dual role. In Sorolla's painting of the boy we've been looking at, the negative space really plays a single role. It doesn't take on an image of any kind, but simply is a space for the figure to live in, an environment for it. But in his seascape, every shape in the seascape plays a dual role. Now here's what I mean by that. The sky is an image of sky. The clouds in the sky are images within the sky. The water is an image of water. But the sky becomes a negative shape when we are focusing on the boats. And the boats obviously here are the center of interest. And so the sky becomes supportive, even though it's also a positive shape that we know to be the image of the sky. The sky itself becomes negative as the clouds become positive. And the same thing in the water. The water itself becomes negative. The image of the water becomes negative, but becomes positive as water when we're focusing on the reflections in the water. So the shapes that surround shapes or are beside shapes can become negative when our attention is on the other shapes, but they become positive when our attention moves to them and they have an identity we're familiar with. That may be a little bit confusing to understand. Let's look at some other paintings and see how that works. Now you see we have a similar thing here in the Bierstadt painting, where we have sky surrounding mountains, have even a waterfall in there, and then the mountains and water surrounding the trees or the earth. And even within that we have figures surrounded by trees and grass. Well, you can see everything in this painting plays a dual role. When we're focusing on the mountains, the sky around the mountains becomes negative. When we're focusing on the trees, the mountains become negative. Now, the mountains next to the trees, where they're touching the trees there, that is negative space to the trees. The trees occupying that space. But then when we focus on the mountain, the sky is negative space to the mountain. When we're focusing on the waterfall, then the rocks of the mountain are negative to the water. And when we're focusing on the water, then all this becomes negative to the water. That may be stretching the point a bit, but it helps us to understand why it's so important for us to pay equal attention to all the shapes within a painting and how they support each other. Remember, support, that key word. One shape supports another. When we're using those images to support one another, we can get unity in the whole painting. Let's look at some other examples. Here's an excellent example by Kevin McPherson, where obviously the boat is the center of interest. Then the boat becomes a positive space to everything that's surrounded. But then we can look at the distant buildings. The distant buildings become negative in support of the boat here. But the distant buildings, when we look at them, become positive to the sky that's surrounding them. Now, whether we would call the water negative and the buildings positive and the sky negative, the important thing is how those shapes interrelate to each other, that we're not isolating each set of shapes and treating them uniquely, rather that we're paying attention to how they relate to all the images themselves. Another example by McPherson here is this landscape. Every shape in the landscape is positive within itself, but becomes negative to the shape that's surrounding it. So we can see the sky. We go way back in the sky itself is negative to the clouds, and then that whole area becomes negative or supportive. Remember, that means space around, supportive to this range of mountains. This becomes supportive to this, so then this becomes negative when our attention is on this area. And then if we go on down in the front, we can see this becomes positive and the areas around it become negative when we are looking at this shape. Each shape has an identity as an image, as well as is serving as both negative and positive in their relationship to each other. Let's examine more specifically now what we mean when we say negative space supports positive space. If you will notice all the examples I showed you, not only does negative space surround the positive space, but it helps shape the positive space. And how we handle that negative space determines how we perceive the whole painting and how the viewer perceives the whole painting. Now, a good example, excellent example here in Kevin McPherson's Tug is what he's done right back in here. So we'll just zoom in on this area right in here, and I'm going to, with Kevin's forgiveness, I hope, I'm going to do a little bit of hashing to show you how we will perceive this whole scene differently if Kevin had made a different decision. What if the boat had been in a different position? Or what if he had been in a different position according to the way the light's shining, according to the way the light's hitting these buildings back here? And what if the lighter building here had been placed behind here? How would we perceive this painting differently? All right, with Kevin's permission and forgiveness, I hope, I'm going to do a little bit of hashing and show you. Do you see now? With the light behind that area, it totally changes it. It changes how we see it. It changes our perception. It changes how we see the total painting. I won't keep that there long. But what we do to the values of that negative space, what we do to the colors of that negative space determines our perception and how the whole painting will be expressed and interpreted. Let's look now at some techniques artists use to cause negative spaces to support positive spaces rather than to isolate away from them. To do that, let's go back to Kevin McPherson's tugboat painting and examine the techniques he used to cause that negative space to support the painting rather than to conflict with it. One of the major techniques artists use that he's used here is de-emphasize. That means that no matter what appears in the reference, whether it's a photo or whether it's in plain air, whatever appears in that reference, we reinterpret with de-emphasis. Now, to drive home that point, I found a photo on Pixabay right here. Another scene of another tugboat. Of course, this is not the one that Kevin used, but the characteristics are similar, my guess is. So in the photo, we see background buildings, much as we see here, background buildings. What I want you to notice is the strong value contrast of the shadows and light areas in these background buildings. Kevin has de-emphasized that value contrast by making the darker areas lighter and the lighter areas a little darker. The lighting in this one is a little different from Kevin's painting, but the principle is the same. So by de-emphasizing the values, bringing value relationships closer rather than copying exactly what the eye is seeing, we can de-emphasize those negative areas and enable them to support or enable the positive areas of the main center of tension to be more evident. So de-emphasizing to not call attention to the negative areas is one technique, but along with that is a technique for enabling that negative area, though de-emphasized, to support the positive area by repetition of some sort. Now in this case, look very, very closely. It's very subtle. Well, Kevin has taken the reds here, reduced their intensity and value, and repeated them right back in here in these areas. And the more you look of that, the more you see. And that enables the eye then to, you might say, blend or to read the area as supportive. And you can look in the reflections in the water and see just a little bit of that mixed in with the water in these areas right in here. So we have the repetition of that red, which is really evident here because of the color contrast of red with everything else, and also the saturation of this red in places is really, really strong compared to the desaturation of the reds and other hues we see in the distance. Now, a third element to those two techniques is emphasizing with contrast. And what we're seeing here is the emphasizing of the low saturation in the distance with the higher saturation within the positive space itself. Going back to repetition, we can see where he has capitalized on some of the movements he sees in the distance, some of the visual movement where we have recognized the verticals here and here and here and here. And those verticals are really repeating the movement of the verticals we see here. So that movement's being repeated but de-emphasized. What master painters do is look for potential and then look for what you can do with that potential to cause the negative area to support the positive area. So that's what we're going to be doing with this study. We're going to be able to look at references and find potential potential within those negative areas for de-emphasizing values in the distance or in the negative areas, if that's what needs to happen. We're going to be looking for potential for repetition of colors within the negative area into the positive area, or if necessary, potential for emphasizing with the saturation contrast. And it might be necessary to repeat some element within the negative area, but to de-emphasize the negative. Find things to repeat, repeating direction or repeating color. We find the potential there, and then we make it work.
The space around, and you might, I wish maybe I should have said the space immediately around, but the space around it is also a part of the space that extends, and say in the instant of sky or mountain or something like that. If you look, space around any image actually forms that image. So it's not just the image that's forming itself, that makes it positive, but it's the space around it that is also forming it. So what we do with that space around it, the way we enable that, the way we relate the space around it to the image itself, that's negative supporting positive. That's what I was trying to point out, especially in the Bierstadt, where it's really, really evident, where the trees are there, but the where the mountains are touching the trees is helping form that shape of the trees. So they're working together. But in the case of say still life paintings or vignette studies where we'll do a study just within a space, you've seen a lot of those. Well, so it's kind of not quite like the Sorolla study of the figure, but the negative space just plays that single role then of being in an environment. But if it's not sensitively handled, or in many cases, and I didn't want to extend into this, but in the case of drawing, if we're creating a drawing of something, how we position the images that we're drawing will create negative space as well as the positive space. So it's all those work together to help to create the images that we're looking at and to help influence how our eyes sees them and how our eyes interpret them. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.